A few months ago, I visited a quiet, nondescript apartment in a suburb of Osaka. Inside, an elderly woman sat on the floor, surrounded by nothing but a few cardboard boxes. She wasn't moving house. She had simply sold everything she owned. Her eyes, however, weren't filled with regret. Instead, she had this unsettling, glassy-eyed fervor as she showed me a small, gilded vase she'd purchased for nearly $50,000. To her, this wasn't just a piece of decor. It was spiritual insurance, a way to scrub away the sins of her ancestors and protect her children from a looming catastrophe. She spoke with deep reverence about a true father who understood the world's secret history. She believed she was part of a grand mission to save Japan. But when I asked her about the specific teachings of this leader, Sun Myung Moon, she didn't point to descriptions of peace. Instead, she echoed a chilling logic, that because of Japan's past, its people must suffer to achieve indemnity. She seemed almost proud to tell me that Japan was the Eve nation, the sinner that had to give everything to the Adam nation, Korea. Then I mentioned a specific quote from her true father that I'd found in his internal speeches. I told her that Moon had explicitly stated that Japan's living standards must be slashed to 1/3 and its taxes raised fivefold to pay for its crimes. I waited for her to recoil, to defend her country's prosperity, or at least express confusion. But she just nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile on her face. To her, the destruction of her own middle-class life wasn't a tragedy. It was a requirement. That moment of quiet, voluntary ruin was haunting. But what's even more baffling is how this ideology didn't just stay in empty apartments in Osaka. It reached the very highest corridors of power in Tokyo. The same politicians who built their careers on Japanese nationalism and restoring pride were, for decades, the secret partners of a man who preached that Japan deserved to be bled dry. This contradiction so deep, it eventually led to a homemade shotgun on a street corner in Nara and exposed a shadow government that had been hiding in plain sight for 70 years.
That image of the elderly woman voluntarily sacrificing her financial future based on a doctrine of national guilt is the perfect entry point. It really just lays out the devastating consequence of the system we're about to unpack. Our mission today is to understand the systemic mechanism that allowed this spiritual and financial exploitation to thrive. We're going to trace the geopolitical origins of the alliance between the Unification Church, officially known in Japan as the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, and Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. And finally, we will analyze the sweeping legal and social reckoning that has followed since that assassination violently ripped the political veil away.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the foundational engine of this whole operation, which is the theology itself. This entire system was built on an unholy trinity of doctrine, guilt, and the resulting financial extraction.
What's fascinating here is how effectively the Unification Church weaponized historical trauma. I mean, the core theological framework, as preached by its founder, Sun Myung Moon, designated Japan as the Eve nation. According to this doctrine, Japan was the original spiritual sinner tasked with atoning for its grievous historical crimes against Korea, which was designated the Adam nation.
And the sin they were referring to wasn't some abstract theological concept. It was the very real, brutal history of the 1910 to 1945 colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula. So historical trauma was transformed into a present-day, inescapable financial requirement for every single Japanese member.
Exactly. The requirement was indemnity. This is the core concept we need to understand. Indemnity wasn't a suggestion. It was a spiritual debt, a reparation that Japanese members were told they had to pay to cleanse their lineage, scrub away the sins of their ancestors, and achieve spiritual salvation for themselves and their descendants. This payment was non-negotiable and required the surrender of personal wealth, often resulting in complete personal financial ruin.
The rhetoric Moon used wasn't subtle either. It wasn't just about making small sacrifices. The quotes that define this doctrine are shocking in their explicit demand for economic destruction. He explicitly advocated that Japan must be severely punished for its transgressions against Korea, stating that the required payment of indemnity meant Japan's living standards had to be slashed to 1/3, and its national taxes raised fivefold. This wasn't commentary. This was the official written requirement for the nation's spiritual purification.
It creates a foundational, chilling irony. The ultimate act of spiritual purification required the Japanese follower to actively desire and financially work toward the ruin of their own economic status and the status of their nation. It's a profound psychological inversion where financial loss becomes moral elevation.
To grasp how that doctrine translated from spiritual obligation into massive systematic cash flow, we need to look at the mechanism they perfected. The spiritual sales, known in Japanese as reikenshouho. This wasn't standard tithing. It was a highly sophisticated, high-pressure psychological exploitation system, primarily targeting financially vulnerable groups, often older women and housewives.
Right. The structure of reikenshouho was designed for maximum psychological leverage. Sales teams were trained using internal manuals, sometimes titled something like Your Honey Talk. The initial step wasn't selling, it was infiltration. They would set up seemingly innocuous booths offering things like free palm readings or asking participants to fill out detailed questionnaires about their lives, their fears, their health. The objective was ruthlessly specific. Find your customer's weak point.
So they were gathering intelligence on anxieties, vulnerabilities, and any existing misfortune in the person's life illness, relationship stress, financial worries.
Precisely. Once a vulnerability was identified, the mark would be escalated to a spiritual center to meet a so-called great teacher. It's here that the manipulation turned completely cruel. That teacher would attribute the victim's misfortune, say, a chronic illness or a son's academic failure, not to coincidence, but directly to bad karma or the unappeased spirits of restless ancestors. They claim these ancestors were suffering in hell because the family line had not paid its spiritual indemnity for Japan's national sins.
Wow. That immediately links the individual's daily struggle right back to the core doctrine of national guilt. The psychological leverage must have been immense.
It was paralyzing, and the only solution presented was a financial one, a massive donation or the purchase of a spiritual product. They often instilled sheer terror. Victims were told that if they failed to comply, the ancestor suffering would manifest violently in the present. A relative might die in a sudden accident, or the suffering of a deceased spouse in hell would appear to the living in nightmarish dreams. This was blackmail, forcing often elderly individuals to liquidate savings, take out loans, or borrow from relatives, all under the guise of liberating their bloodline.
We have a clear example of this dynamic through the story of a woman named Keiko, detailing the human cost. We know she was a devoted mother and housewife in Shizuoka, and she was confronted by these representatives. She wasn't wealthy, but she had inherited this heavy sense of responsibility. When told her family's misfortunes were the direct result of spiritual debt incurred by her ancestors during the colonial occupation, that heavy inherited burden became a personal, urgent crisis.
For Keiko, this wasn't simply a fraudulent transaction. It was a deeply felt existential imperative. She was convinced that the marble pagoda she was being sold was the only way to save her family from this inherited curse. We know that she drained her children's college fund and sold her most cherished possessions, including her wedding jewelry. The goal was to provide indemnity. This highlights that the church wasn't just extracting cash, it was exploiting a specific, powerful cultural concept, inherited national responsibility for profit.
And what were they actually selling? These items, which were supposed to carry immense spiritual power, were often mass manufactured overseas, correct?
Yes. The term spiritual merchandise is a sanitized way of describing the products, which were manufactured by UC-affiliated companies based primarily in South Korea. This included entities like Ilshin Building Stone Core, which manufactured the marble items, and Ilhwa Core, which produced highly priced ginseng and dietary supplements. The margins were astonishingly high.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of that inflation?
Easily. Consider the miniature marble pagodas Keiko bought. While they may have had a material and manufacturing value of perhaps, say, $3,000, they were routinely sold to devout followers for sums reaching $66,000.
$66,000.
Name seals used in Japan for official signatures were sold for up to $15,000, despite having a commercial value of maybe $125. The ginseng concentrate, purportedly used to appease angry spirits, could be sold to a grieving widow for $50,000. These were not luxury goods, they were spiritual necessities sold at profit margins that crossed the line from commerce into criminal exploitation.
That vast profit clearly wasn't designed to stay in Japan. This nation was essentially transformed into the primary financial engine for Moon's global ambitions. Japan was absolutely critical. It was the UC's central cash cow. Financial analyses indicate that Japan provided the vast majority, as much as 70% of the Unification Church's total global income during its peak exploitation phase. The money flow was constant and massive. Between 1975 and 1984, the sources show at least $800 million was transferred directly from Japan to the United States to fund Moon's international operations, including flagship projects like the money-losing but politically influential Washington Times newspaper.
$800 million. And that's just in one decade.
That's what we can track.
The financial scale of the reikenshouho scheme is overwhelming. How did the authorities respond when the depth of the fraud began to surface? Well, by the mid-1980s, the complaints became impossible to ignore. By 1987, Japanese bar associations had recorded over 14,500 victims who had been defrauded of documented assets exceeding $165 million. However, lawyers working the cases universally stressed that this figure was likely only a small fraction of the actual take. The deep-seated sense of insecurity and fear instilled by the church kept the vast majority of victims silent for decades.
And when public scrutiny finally made the blatant spiritual sales tactics too risky, the organization simply found a new internal mechanism to maintain the cash flow. They shifted from exploiting the public to exploiting their own members more aggressively.
That's the key pivot that occurred around 2009. The organization began focusing on internal special donations from existing members rather than high-pressure sales to new external targets. This required the organization to create an intense internal quota system. A former high-ranking official who later left the church revealed that the Japanese headquarters set an astonishing annual target, approximately 30 billion yen, which translates to over $210 million.
A $210 million annual target puts unbelievable pressure on the followers. It turns devotion into a corporate quota system.
It creates a system of forced financial compliance. While church leaders publicly denied imposing specific quotas on individual followers, the pressure was ruthlessly transmitted down the chain from headquarters to regional chapters and then to local church leaders. The former official confirmed that the structural pressure meant members were still aggressively pursued, forced to meet those targets through continuous giving. Furthermore, to justify the ongoing need for these enormous donations, the church started weaving new elements into the indemnity doctrine in the late 1990s, demanding offerings and blessings toward ancestors for past sins. This change in methodology, from external sales to internal donations, did not alter the predatory, profit-driven nature of the organization. It simply turned existing members into a closed-loop funding source.
So we have an ideology that explicitly calls for the financial ruin of Japan, and a financial machine that successfully extracts hundreds of millions of dollars from the Japanese populace. This leads us to the central contradiction. How did this organization gain not just tolerance, but active political protection and legitimacy from the very politicians who claim to stand for Japanese pride and nationalism?
This is where we move into part 2, the Cold War nexus. The answer lies in geopolitical expediency. The alliance between the LDP and the Unification Church was a profound marriage of convenience, forged in the intense anti-communist environment of the post-World War II era. The UC's extreme anti-communist stance provided the essential common ground, a strategic asset far too valuable for the conservative LDP to ignore.
And the architect of this unholy alliance was Nobusuke Kishi, a figure of immense significance in post-war Japan, the former prime minister and, critically, Shinzo Abe's grandfather.
Kishi is the absolute cornerstone of this story. To understand his strategic decision, you have to understand his past. He was a Class A war crime suspect, arrested after World War II, though never ultimately indicted or tried. He helped found the LDP and championed a deeply conservative nationalistic vision for Japan. For Kishi and his inner circle, the Cold War was an ideological fight for survival, and anyone fighting communism was an ally, regardless of their background or their methods. The UC fit this bill perfectly.
It sounds like Kishi's priority wasn't Japanese national pride or protecting citizens from financial fraud, but rather securing anti-communist infrastructure.
Precisely. His political vision eclipsed all other concerns. The connection was established early and given immediate legitimacy. The UC was granted legal religious corporation status in Japan in 1964. Tellingly, the organization established its headquarters right next to Kishi's residence in Tokyo's Shibuya Ward. That physical proximity was an open signal of political protection from the highest levels of the conservative establishment.
The UC didn't just offer ideological alignment. They provided concrete political services through their specific political front group, the International Federation for Victory Over Communism, or IFVOC, which Moon established in 1968.
IFVOC was the functional link. For LDP politicians, especially those running in tightly contested local elections, the UC offered a highly motivated, disciplined, and reliable grassroots political force. They provided free, dedicated campaign volunteers who worked tirelessly, and more importantly, they offered coordinated block voting. In Japan's multi-seat electoral districts, a guaranteed block of votes for a specific candidate was muscle that was often more valuable than outright campaign donations.
So the relationship was transactional, protection and legitimacy in exchange for election muscle.
That was the foundational arrangement that kept the alliance sustained across decades. The alliance went even deeper than Kishi. His close political associate, the powerful right-wing figure Sasakawa Rishichi, who led the influential Japan Shipbuilding Industry Foundation, became the honorary chairman of IFVOC, cementing the alliance within the LDP's most powerful conservative factions. The LDP gained an extremely efficient political machine. The UC gained the impunity needed to continue its fraudulent operations.
And that impunity is what allowed the LDP elite to overlook that glaring central ideological contradiction. The LDP campaigned relentlessly on restoring Japanese pride and strength, yet they were secretly allied with a group whose official doctrine required the financial humiliation and punishment of the Japanese people. Seems absurdly cynical.
It is the defining feature of the shadow government connection. It's hard to fathom how these astute nationalist politicians reconciled partnering with a Korean-centric cult that preached Japan was the Eve nation, destined for punishment and financial extraction. The simplest answer is that mutual benefit transcended ideological consistency. The anti-communist utility they provided guaranteed their protection, full stop.
Beyond electoral support, the UC used this political leverage to influence policy, particularly on sensitive social issues, proving their utility wasn't just electoral.
That's a key point. The Unification Church has always held deeply conservative social views, particularly its fierce opposition to LGBTQ rights and same-sex marriage. This stance dovetailed perfectly with the internal resistance within the LDP, making Japan the only G7 country that still lacks legal recognition for same-sex marriage. Critiques emerged that UC-affiliated groups actively solicited pledges from LDP members, asking them to explicitly promise a cautious stance on the issue, showing direct policy influence.
Yeah, and we saw the appearance of legitimacy granted when the government itself allowed the church to mask its controversial past.
That's right. In 2015, during Shinzo Abe's second term, the government granted the Unification Church's request to officially change its legal name to the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. Critics saw this move as a deliberate effort to obscure the historical controversies and move away from the notoriety associated with the Unification Church name. The political environment under Abe made this type of request viable.
To truly appreciate the scale of this organization's political methods and reach, we have to zoom out and look at its global operations. Specifically, the infamous Koreagate scandal in the United States during the 1970s. This was where the UC's playbook for influencing high-level government was refined.
Koreagate, which exploded into public view and was documented in the 1978 Fraser Congressional Committee report, centered on South Korean efforts to influence U.S. Congress members. The Unification Church was found to be a core essential player in this scheme, working closely with the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, the KCIA, to achieve specific geopolitical goals. Their primary objective was reversing U.S. President Nixon's plans to withdraw American troops from South Korea at the height of the Cold War.
The sources indicate this was a sophisticated operation involving not just lobbying, but front groups and financial manipulation.
Absolutely. The Fraser report confirmed active cooperation between the KCIA and organizations linked to the UC. Moon's associates, most notably Eltin Kerm Pak Bo-hai, were instrumental. They created seemingly innocuous cultural fronts like the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation, which sponsored the well-known children's dance troupe, the Little Angels.
The Little Angels, a children's dance troupe used for political cover.
That's precisely what the investigation alleged. The congressional inquiry detailed how the Little Angels concerts were strategically utilized as a way for Moon and his top followers to access, mingle with, and take photographs alongside influential American politicians. This allowed them to enhance Moon's image as a legitimate religious leader and provide cover for intense political lobbying and the movement of cash. Pak Bo-hee even suggested in testimony that the children themselves, when traveling internationally, sometimes acted as couriers, carrying amounts less than the $5,000 threshold to bypass U.S. currency control laws when moving cash across borders.
The audacity of using cultural organizations and children to facilitate influence and potentially move undeclared money for geopolitical ends is truly remarkable. But the financial schemes went even deeper than cash couriers.
They involved complex banking manipulation. The Koreagate report detailed how the Moon organization, leveraging its global network of religious, secular, and business entities, systematically violated U.S. tax, banking, and currency laws. A key focus was the Diplomat National Bank in Washington, D.C. UC entities poured at least $1 million into purchasing shares in the bank, and the report concluded that the South Korean government, specifically the KCIA, was involved in the bank's establishment and operation. This structure provided a clear conduit for international cash movements.
And we can trace the origin of that cash right back to Japan. the Eve nation paying its indemnity.
The money trail is crystal clear. The report noted a stunning example where, over a 15-month period, more than $7 million was deposited into a specific Unification Church bank account, with over $6 million of that, the vast majority originating directly from Japan. This illustrates the central loop. Japanese followers were defrauded based on national guilt, and that money was immediately exported and used to buy political influence in Washington, D.C., furthering geopolitical goals favorable to the organization's founder.
Let's bring this back to the LDP. The strategic relationship was so entrenched that even when Moon faced legal trouble in the U.S., the Japanese political elite stood by him.
That is the ultimate proof of the political debt owed. After Moon was convicted of tax fraud in the U.S. in 1982 and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison in Connecticut, Nobusuke Kishi personally intervened. In 1984, Kishi wrote a highly unusual, high-level letter to President Ronald Reagan, imploring him to pardon Moon, whom Kishi described as a genuine man staking his life on promoting freedom. This intervention by a former Japanese prime minister to a sitting U.S. president on behalf of a convicted felon who was simultaneously overseeing massive fraud in Japan underscores the deep, persistent strategic connection the UC had secured through its anti-communist utility. It was a favor being paid back at the highest possible level.
The impunity fostered by that decades-long alliance meant the organization, financed by the devastating forced donations of Japanese housewives, operated untouchable in the political shadows. But that veil was violently ripped away in July 2022. The system could not withstand the pressure of individual tragedy exposed publicly.
And we now move to part 3, the aftermath, the catalyst of the assassination, the resulting crisis of legitimacy, and the legal pushback that followed.
The single shocking act of Shinzo Abe's assassination was the catalyst that changed everything. The alleged killer, Tetsuya Yamagami, was immediately clear about his motive. He didn't target Abe because of his politics, but because of his political promotion of the Unification Church. The church had financially devastated Yamagami's mother, forcing her into bankruptcy after she donated an estimated 100 million yen of the family's assets.
The assassination instantly forced the national spotlight onto what had been a decades-old whispered secret, the LDP's deep and pervasive ties to the UC. It triggered an immediate political crisis. The LDP was forced to conduct an internal survey to quantify the scale of the entanglement. The results were damning. Almost half of its 379 dial members admitted to having some form of dealing with the cult. Furthermore, the connections extended far beyond Tokyo. Hundreds of regional politicians, including 290 prefectural assembly members and 7 governors, also admitted to associations. The murder didn't just expose an affiliation, it exposed the systematic reach of a shadow government.
The ensuing public outrage quickly shifted the narrative from the politics of Abe's death to the countless victims of the church, especially the Nisei, the second-generation followers. This is the profound social reckoning sparked by the event.
The experience of the Nisei is the most heartbreaking testament to the church's financial predation. These are individuals who grew up facing systemic neglect and intense financial hardship because their parents were pressured to meet those crushing donation quotas and pay indemnity.
This lost generation has horrific stories of trauma stemming directly from the church's demands. We hear accounts of children being starved because the fridge was perpetually empty, of inability to pay tuition fees, or even of parents creating significant credit card debt using their children's names and identities, forcing the next generation to shoulder the cult-induced debt.
Their childhoods were defined by financial insecurity and the constant fear of their parents' obsession with meeting quotas. Yamagami's own background mirrors this trauma. His mother's decision to file for bankruptcy and his subsequent inability to finish university due to lack of funds became a national symbol of the suffering caused by the UC's predatory practices. Since 2022, this generation has organized into a movement, finally finding the voice and the public platform to demand legal recognition of the profoundly damaging and predatory nature of their upbringing. They are demanding government action and redress.
The massive political pressure and public outrage finally led to unprecedented legal steps by the Japanese government. They couldn't ignore the systemic problem anymore.
The government responded definitively by invoking the rarely used legal mechanism of dissolution. In 2023, the Education Ministry formally requested the Tokyo District Court order the revocation of the Unification Church's legal religious corporation status. The ministry gathered substantial evidence, over 5,000 documents and testimonial evidence based on interviews with more than 170 people, citing manipulative fundraising, the sowing of intense fear, and severe harm to families.
And the court agreed with the severity of the claims.
They absolutely did. In a landmark decision in March 2025, the Tokyo District Court ordered the dissolution of the UC. This is a revocation of its legal status, which carries massive implications. It removes its valuable tax-exempt privileges and initiates a legal requirement for asset liquidation. The court was clear, stating that the church's ongoing problems were continuous, extensive, and that a dissolution order was necessary because there was no possibility of voluntary reform within the organization.
This action is historic, given Japan's constitutional commitment to religious liberty. This isn't a common legal tool. What is the key legal distinction here?
The distinction is critical for understanding the sophistication of the government's action. The Unification Church is the first religious group in Japan to be subject to a revocation order based purely on continuous violations of the civil code. Previous dissolution cases involve groups that face severe criminal charges, the most famous example being the Omume Shinrikyo Doomsday Cult, which carried out the 1995 sarin gas attacks. The government strategically used the civil code because the burden of proof for criminal charges against the UC's current leadership was complex and time-consuming. The civil code allowed the government to focus on continuous civil wrongdoing, manipulative fundraising, and proving that the church's true purpose was unjust profit-making under the guise of religion.
So the court essentially affirmed that the organization was a criminal enterprise disguised as a faith group.
Precisely. The court rulings have consistently validated the long-standing complaints of the victims, confirming that the church's activities were not for legitimate spiritual purposes, but were intended to acquire massive profits through coercion and fear. The sheer scale of financial liability underscores this point. The Agency for Cultural Affairs reported that court settlements, both in and out of court, have already exceeded 20 billion yen, roughly $132 million, involving more than 1,500 people. This ruling provides a powerful legal affirmation that the church's financial system was fundamentally unjust.
So, as we synthesize this deep dive, we've followed three complex, intertwined threads. First, the theological doctrine rooted in national guilt and the demand for financial destruction and indemnity to fund a global movement.
Second, the decades-long political alliance, born out of the anti-communist anxiety of the Cold War and secured by figures like Nobusuke Kishi, which provided essential political protection and legitimacy to a financially extractive group.
And third, the devastating financial mechanisms that preyed upon vulnerable individuals and families, leading directly to the high-profile crisis of Shinzo Abe's assassination. That violent rupture finally unleashed the necessary legal and social reckoning for a generation of victims who had been forced into silence by shame and fear.
We have witnessed how an ideology of voluntary ruin, disguised as spiritual indemnity, became the financial fuel for a global empire, which successfully traded massive political support for legal protection deep within the ruling echelons of one of the world's most stable democracies. The unraveling of this decades-old alliance shows that no matter how deep the ties between political power and religious wealth run, the system cannot withstand the pressure when the quiet, personal tragedies of the individual victims finally burst into the public light.